Welcome to rePROs Fight Back, a podcast on all things rePRO. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and each episode I will be taking you to the front lines of the escalating fight over our sexual and reproductive health and rights at home and abroad. Each episode, I will be speaking with leaders who are fighting to protect our reproductive health and rights, to ensure that no one's reproductive health depends on where they live. It's time for rePROs to fight back. Welcome to rePROs Fight Back. I'm your host, Jenny Wetter, and today I am so excited for today's episode. We have two people that I am so excited to talk to that you just don't know. So you may know them from their wonderful podcast, Boom Lawyered, or you may know them from Rewire.news, or you may know them from Twitter, where you will see them as Jess Pieklo tweets as Hedge Mommy, and Imani Gandy tweets as Angry Black Lady. Both amazing follows, and you should definitely make sure to check them out at Rewire.news and also their podcast, Boom Lawyered. I'm so excited to talk to them today because there has been a lot of shit happening around the country with abortion bans, and so we're going to do an emergency episode to talk about everything that's happening, and I couldn't think of better people to talk to than Imani and Jess. So stay tuned for a great interview. Hi, Jess and Imani. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
All right. I will let you both introduce yourselves so that way people can know who's talking when.
Hi, I'm Jess Pieklo. I am Vice President of Law and Courts at Rewire.news, and I am the co-host of Boom Lawyer podcast with Imani, and have been doing legal journalism on abortion rights and access for, a long time, over 10 years now. So this is a thing that I like to talk about.
Awesome.
This is Imani Gandy. I also have been doing legal journalism for a while, not as long as Jessica, about 8 or 9 years. I'm Senior Legal Analyst and also co-host of Boom Lawyered, and also the founder of Angry Black Lady Chronicles.
So that's definitely why it feels like I've been reading you guys since I started working at Population Institute, because I started about 11 years ago. So I have been reading you basically the whole time I've been here. So we decided we need to do an emergency podcast because there has been some crazy shit going on in the last week.
You don't say.
So I figured we'd start with, the other side keeps talking about these heartbeat bans. So maybe you want to talk about what are heartbeat bans?
First of all, heartbeat bans are nothing of the sort. The term heartbeat ban is effectively a marketing term, and this is something that the anti-abortion, anti-choice movement is very good at, and that is market testing phrases that appeal to emotion over science and reasoning. So we all know, or maybe we don't, and if you don't, then I'm about to teach you something, that at 6 weeks there is no heartbeat present, right? And so what these are bans that purport to ban legal abortion as soon as a fetal heart tone can be detected, which can be as early as 6 weeks in pregnancy. And we've seen them pop up in states, in places like Ohio, in Kentucky, in Georgia, but we've had these for around a little bit. Ohio tried this as early as 2011, I think. Iowa has one that's been blocked. Arkansas and North Dakota all do. So these have been floating around for a while, but folks in states got really excited about them this year, in part, I think, because of the shift in the federal courts, which I think we'll talk about. But what they are unconstitutional abortion bans.
At 6 weeks, there is no fetus. It's an embryo. And so at 6 weeks, there is no heartbeat. There's like a fetal tone, right? It's electric activity in the fetal pole. So as Jessica said, just like with partial birth abortion, this terminology, quote unquote, partial birth abortion, heartbeat ban is just a marketing tool, and it appeals to emotion. And what's really interesting about it is that a recent study has shown that people are opposed to heartbeat bans when they actually understand what, quote unquote, heartbeat ban will do, and that is effectively end abortion care. So the language that we use is very, very important when talking about these sorts of restrictions.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true, because it does play in people's emotion. You hear a heartbeat and you think, much more fully developed than it actually is.
And not only does it play on emotion, what we're seeing in the courts too is that it's really playing on what conservatives see are legal openings to challenge some of the very tenets of abortion rights jurisprudence. So if the court is willing to determine that viability can be rolled back to something like the detection of a fetal heartbeat, for example, then that creates a whole host of different problems for abortion rights in the courts. And so it's absolutely a play to emotions, but it is, I do think that there are specific attempts to try and test the waters to see, which of these arguments the federal courts are willing to bite on, and, maybe all of them.
Okay, so things got really crazy in the last week or so. So let's start with Georgia. What happened in Georgia?
Well, Georgia passed a quote-unquote fetal heartbeat ban that bans abortion essentially at 6 weeks, which, is before most people even know that they're pregnant. And the way that the law is written, I think there has been some confusion about whether or not pregnant people will be criminalized. The way the law is written right now, that is not the case. But as we've seen in states like Georgia, states like Alabama, there are aggressive prosecutors that are willing to use laws that were not intended to ensnare pregnant people to ensnare pregnant people. So I think it's important to recognize that several things are important to recognize. One is that abortion is legal in Georgia. Two is that law will most likely be blocked and never go into effect. Three is that it's just really important to make sure that we are talking about these things in the right way, and that we are making sure that people understand that, the anti-choicers' definition of pregnancy isn't actually pregnancy. I actually had someone on Twitter yesterday say to me that by the time the fetus is accepted into the body, pregnancy has occurred.
What?
So we are talking about people who, apparently think that fetuses apply to bodies like they do colleges. Put into the body that they like. They're on a waiting list for another body. I mean, it's just, these people don't have a basic grasp of biology. And so, legislators can say things like, a heartbeat can be detected at 6 weeks, or a fetus can feel pain at 20 weeks. And we're throwing science completely out the window, primarily because these folks refuse to believe in science. And I think I went off on a tangent that was far from what my original point was, so I'm going to stick with it.
No, that was something near and dear to my heart. I definitely have a science background, so the assault on science we've seen the last several years is like one of the things that really gets me angry.
Yeah, and it should really, because the way in which courts rule on these sorts of issues is that they will defer to legislatures, right? And so now we have legislatures that are crafting these bills that contain these very long preambles that talk about all of the science that they've studied and all the science that they are marshaling in order to come up with these restrictions. And that science is junk science that has been formulated or created by, quote unquote, pro-life OBGYNs, or people like, Vincent Rue, or these other sort of titans of anti-choice activism who don't have any science background, who aren't doctors, but who have yet created these institutes that develop and propagate junk science. So you have, the Elliott Institute, which is one such organization, and then you have the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which is the research arm of the Susan B. Anthony list. And so these organizations are all junk science, but they're just peer reviewing each other in order to make that science more legitimate. So by the time it makes its way into these bills, courts will look at it and say, well, clearly these legislatures have examined this science, and they've decided that, we really can't tell if there's a fetal heartbeat at 6 weeks. So the tie goes to the junk science. And so then we have courts that are basically rubber stamping junk science without actually examining it. And, that just doesn't make any sense in my view.
Right. And to bring it full circle to the original question here, that was an opportunity created by the Supreme Court in the decision Gonzalez v. Carhart, which upheld the federal so-called partial birth abortion ban, right? That was should have been under a traditional constitutional framework considered an unconstitutional pre-viability abortion ban. It should have it was nearly, it's the model bill before it that gave us Stenhart Stenberg v. Carhart, was declared unconstitutional. The difference was a change in the court. And so conservatives and Republicans saw that and have gone with it since then, building on each win. So in Gonzalez, we had an assault on science also, and the conservative Supreme Court said that's okay. Lawmakers can flip a coin, and they have just made it to ad absurdum at this point.
Yes, you might want to explain what Stenberg and Gonzalez are, just in case people don't really know.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. So Gonzalez v. Carhart is the Supreme Court decision, like I said, that upheld the so-called federal partial birth abortion ban, and that bill was effectively a D and X ban. I won't get the medical terminology correct on all of this, so I'm going to defer on some of that because I'll totally bungle it. But it was a ban on a form of second trimester later abortion. And the state of Nebraska had passed one originally, and that had been challenged and struck down by the Supreme Court along the lines of, well, it did not provide any exceptions for the health of the pregnant person or the life of the pregnant person. And also, though, that it was a ban on a procedure before viability, and that was an area that the court had ruled could not happen. And so in between the time of the Nebraska challenge and what would eventually become the Supreme Court case, we had a Republican win in the White House and a shift in momentum. And Republicans passed a federal version of what was effectively the Nebraska law. That got challenged and run all the way up to the Supreme Court. Justice Roberts was involved in some of the strategic defense of that for a while. Like, there's all sorts of really interesting, deep legal weed stuff that goes on with Gonzalez. But it effectively said that when there's matters of scientific dispute, and in this case, it was questions around the procedure at issue, that lawmakers could hold hearings and decide which science they want to believe. And from there, birth institutions like the Lozier Institute, which Imani mentioned, that have created quote unquote science for the purpose of justifying otherwise unconstitutional abortion bans, because it gave state lawmakers the power to say, we choose to believe this particular set of information over this, and courts, for a while didn't do much about it. Now, Justice Breyer pushed back against that in the Holman's Health v. Hellerstedt decision. That was the Supreme Court decision just a few years ago that struck down the Texas trap laws, the admitting privileges requirements and ambulatory surgical center requirements. Justice Breyer and the majority in that decision said, while legislatures are free to choose their facts, so to speak, courts aren't required to rubber stamp them and have an independent duty to look at that. And naturally, the anti-choice world did not like that, and so they have proceeded to really vigorously attack Holman's Health.
Wow, there was so much there.
Yeah, that's a segment you're going to have to go back and listen to again, but I promise you it's worth it because she explained it all perfectly and nailed it. And that's really, it's really what it is. It's just about, whether or not the court is a legitimate institution or whether or not it is just partisan nonsense. And I think we have come to the point where it is partisan nonsense, where the makeup of the court will determine what civil and human rights will be stripped for marginalized people. And we saw that just last week. We saw last week with this Hyatt case, with this franchise tax board case that we did an episode on, where the court tossed out 40 years of precedent. And so this idea that, Brett Kavanaugh is going to get up in, his confirmation hearing and say, oh, I just call balls and strikes, Roe was settled law. Well, now we know you don't really give that much of a shit about settled law. So can we just, stop this nonsense and just really focus on what we're dealing with here? And that is an extremely partisan court that is committed to undermining abortion rights in whatever way it can. And the only thing that we have saving us is whether or not Chief Justice John Roberts is more concerned about banning abortion or more concerned about the court further devolving into partisan shenanigans.
A lot of these bans are fairly similar, but maybe we want to talk real quick about what happened in Alabama.
Sure. So where Georgia passed these so-called heartbeat 6-week bans, Alabama just went for it and passed an all-out abortion ban except in a very minimal exception. And said very specifically that the idea of this near total ban is to pose a direct challenge to Roe versus Wade. The state of Alabama believes that the time is right to do so. And the law is not in effect. It is so patently unconstitutional that there's no reason why a federal court should ever let it take effect. And the ACLU of Alabama, I know, is hard at work preparing a challenge to it, but it doesn't change the fact that this is the conversation that's happening in state houses.
Yeah, I think my favorite terrible thing that came out of that was hearing them argue, well, yeah, you could get an abortion until you knew you were pregnant.
I mean, but that exactly sums it up, right? Right? I mean, one of the things, I mean, Imani touched on it, but it's true, so true in Alabama too, is that these bills are part of a long campaign. In Alabama, we saw folks like failed Senate candidate Roy Moore, when he was on the Alabama Supreme Court, do everything he could to try and extend state laws that were already in effect to marginalized people with pregnancy outcomes that he did not like. And so he has made it no surprise that this is part of the conservative agenda there. And in terms of impact, these bills are going hand in hand in states that have worked significantly to disenfranchise populations. And so that has to be part of that conversation. Alabama is disenfranchising folks at a rapid pace. Georgia is disenfranchising folks at a rapid pace. These are folks from marginalized communities and also going to be the most impacted by these criminal abortion bans.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is those already really marginalized are going to be the most impacted. Rich women are always going to be able to leave the state and go somewhere else to access safe care. But a lot of minorities and people without economic means are already being impacted by the restrictions that are already being enforced. And this would just make it further impossible for them to access the care they need.
Absolutely. And I think that's also, it brings up the important issue, which is that so many people are focused on whether or not the court is going to overturn Roe versus Wade. But it's important to recognize that the court doesn't actually have to do that in order to decimate abortion access, right? I mean, they can just decide that some of these, these trap laws, these admitting privileges laws, or these ambulatory surgical center laws, which require, abortion clinics to actually retrofit themselves to be hospitals, including, having enough hallway space so that two gurneys can pass by in a hallway, when that's what goes on in abortion clinics. You don't have a bunch of gurneys being wheeled around in clinics, but it costs millions of dollars for these clinics to follow these regulations, which in essence puts them out of business. And so, again, going back to Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the case that the court established, the case in which the court established the undue burden standard, the question becomes, on a case-by-case basis, does this particular restriction pose an undue burden for this population of reproductive age in this state? And the answer to that question may be yes in Texas and no in Louisiana, right? And so that's what we're dealing with in one of the cases pending before the Supreme Court, June Medical Services versus Gee. It's the same law. It's practically the same fact pattern, but the court is now going to have to wrestle with whether or not these laws affect Louisianans differently than they affect Texans and what that means. And so, then we're just in a situation where the court can decide whatever it wants, depending on the case that's before it, and still not be really overturning Roe or violating Roe in some way.
Yeah, it seems a little bit like the conversation and like the media has really focused on the overturning Roe, and anything short of that is not a huge loss.
Yeah, that's just absolutely short-sighted, right? I mean, Roe could remain on the books for a long time. It could very well be that all of these pre-viability abortion bans, at least the 6-week and 8-week bans, will be struck down because they are preposterous. But people in those states, in Georgia, for example, Georgia could pass a trap law, an admitting privileges law, or some other sort of, ambulatory surgical center law and decimate access in that way. And a court could look at that and say, it's not really an undue burden under Casey, because what does undue burden mean anyway? Right. And so I think that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, between that and then you add in states with 72-hour waiting periods, like it It's just a huge quagmire of trying to access care.
Right. And then you have states like Kentucky, for example, that are mired in multiple lawsuits challenging abortion restrictions and have one clinic, and attorneys from the state are arguing that it doesn't matter because folks in Kentucky who need an abortion can always go to Ohio. After all, it's just right across the border. And thankfully, that is an argument that the federal courts have rejected. We saw Mississippi try to make that argument way back when the first round of trap laws were becoming very popular, and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, a very conservative federal court of appeals, said no, states can't shirk their constitutional duties off on another state. But that hasn't stopped these lawmakers and their attorneys general from arguing that in federal court still. So, though the idea that the threat to Roe is not just about overturning the direct precedent, but about creating a patchwork of unworkable access for most folks, I think, is the reality that we live in now. Yeah.
And really, when you look at a map, I mean, there are just large sections of the country where it's virtually impossible for women or people to access care.
Yeah. And that's by design, that's by design. And we're going to start seeing people trying to help people across state lines in order to get abortion care. And then, then we're probably going to get into a big fight about, extraterritorial jurisdiction and whether or not if abortion is banned in Alabama can prevent its citizens from seeking care in another state. I mean, these are all issues. And the answer to that question is probably not. But there's a hole that's been left open for states to argue that. So, and we're in a brave new world where we've got just incompetent assholes that Trump has appointed to the judiciary. And, there's no telling what these folks are going to do. If they can find any shred of legal standard to hang their hat on, they're going to do that, even if it doesn't make any sense, even if it's law that has been superseded by other law and other case law. These people don't care. They're not smart enough to care, quite frankly.
Georgia and Alabama weren't the only states. You want to touch on Missouri and Louisiana a little bit? Because I feel like they kind of got lost a little bit in the outrage of Georgia and Alabama.
I'll take Louisiana. Imani, you take Missouri because you've written, 5 open letters to the state lawmakers there at this point?
And they won't listen to me. It's very frustrating.
So, Louisiana effectively is, mirroring, which is what Louisiana has done. They mirror Texas in these trap laws. They're mirroring these other states in these heartbeat bans. But what is so frustrating, so sort of additionally frustrating about what's going on in Louisiana is that we have a Democrat who will likely sign a Louisiana 6-week bill into law. And so the mantra that, if we just elect Democrats, everything will be okay is hot garbage. And Louisiana has proven it.
Yeah, and as for Missouri, my God, I mean, it has been 4 or 5 years. I think I wrote my first open letter to Missouri basically asking what the fuck are y'all doing, 4 years ago. And that was at a time when literally the state had one clinic and they were enacting dozens of laws aimed at shutting down this one clinic. It's wild. And so now what we have is Missouri just taking spaghetti and throwing it against the wall and seeing which strands stick. I mean, they've got this bill that bans abortion at 8 weeks. And then if the court happens to overturn that ban, it bans abortion at 14 weeks. And if the court happens to overturn that ban, it bans abortion at 18 weeks and then 20 weeks. It's got 5 separate bans in one bill, only realizing that they're all pre-viability abortion bans and assuming that the court is going to strike down some of the more ridiculous ones, 8 weeks, 14 weeks. But then hopefully the court's going to uphold the later week abortion bans. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. They are doing whatever they can to decimate abortion. And they understand that these laws are unconstitutional. But not only are they willing to waste taxpayer dollars to defend them, but they're willing to craft these bills in a way that sort of hedge against bad rulings, which I think is bizarre. I don't think it's something we've seen before. So way to be a pioneer, Missouri.
There's just so much. And I feel like I spent the last week just so angry and doing so much rage donating to abortion funds in all of these states. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a good way to handle it. I mean, donating to abortion funds, I think, is a very good way to exercise your frustration.
So we've already really kind of talked as we've been going about like why this is happening right now, and it's the change in the Supreme Court. There's, I'm sure, plenty more to say about that. Do you guys want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the retirement of Justice Kennedy and the appointment of Justice Kavanaugh to replace him has put a lot of these anti-abortion restrictions in the state sort of on hyperdrive. But the framework has been building up to this for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we're going to talk about the attack from states, we have to talk about, the response to the Tea Party election, in 2010 and sort of the initial conservative capture there, and the funding by the Koch brothers and far-right groups in state legislatures, and redistricting. I mean, the attack on abortion rights in the federal judiciary is definitely reaching an apex, but I think that it's definitely also a campaign that was started a decade or so ago with real intention in terms of a legislative strategy and a litigation strategy that go hand in hand, in large part in response to the first wave of the Clinton administration, and then most definitely the election of President Barack Obama.
Yeah, there was definitely that huge spike we saw starting in 2010, and those charts are just unreal to look at how many restrictions were proposed and went into place in those couple years right after 2010.
Yeah, and it's in some ways you could say that some of the anti-choice movement maybe saw that as dithering around the edges, but once they had control of state lawmakers, they had a Republican in the White House and Republicans in control of the Senate, they knew that they could then really do damage on the federal courts. And, that's in terms of the federal judiciary where we're at. We've got, the obstruction campaign against Obama's nominees, and then the rapid confirmation of Trump nominees.
Yeah, I really feel like that's something that has gotten lost a little bit, is everybody really seems to focus on the change in the Supreme Court, but there has been a lot of change at the federal court level, and I think that's worth digging into a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump now has something like 1 in 5 circuit court nominees. And Imani has mentioned this already, that we have a whole swath of unqualified nominees. The one thing that unifies them is they've all pledged hostility to abortion rights in Roe versus Wade, and increasingly Brown versus Board of Education. So that's great too.
Right, and it's just in Trump, the Koch brothers, the Federalist Society, found someone who was sort of either incompetent enough or dense enough or malleable enough to allow them to do whatever they want. And I think that in and of itself has a lot to do with why Republicans are so reluctant to even talk about removing him from office, because, the 180 that went on when he was running for president, all of these Republicans were like, oh, he's terrible, we can't allow him to run the country. And now they sat down and allowed this to happen. And I think that is because they are making real gains in the courts, and whatever happens to Trump, those gains will last a generation. And so I really do think that is what this is about in large part.
Yeah, and I also feel like there's a lot of young people, young white men, I think is really when we're talking about Trump's appointees, they've been younger than I feel like in general, and very much white men.
Yeah,
Vanita by design.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, Vanita Gupta yesterday tweeted that, last week or this week, the Senate considered 2 judicial nominees named Dave, yet they have considered exactly 0 black nominees.
Yeah, that's depressing. But it's by design, right? I mean, you put young white dudes on the bench, young white dudes handpicked by the Confederalist Society. You see what I mean? Basically should be Confederalist Society. But handpicked by the Federalist Society, people who've gone to, shining law schools like Liberty University School of Law. I mean, these are people who are not qualified. I think my brain broke was when I realized, I can't remember the name of this woman. There's a 32-year-old white woman, I think she graduated from Liberty University, who's now sitting on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, after having worked as a first and second year associate at this law firm called Williams and Connolly, which is like a white collar, white shoe law firm in Virginia. But both Jess and I were private practice attorneys. We understand what goes on when you are a first year or a second year at a law firm. You're not doing anything. You're not learning anything. So the idea that someone like that is now sitting on the Supreme Court, it just hurts my brain on a molecular level.
Well, and I also feel like another thing that we started to see, and correct me if I'm wrong, is in a lot of the hearings when they talk about abortion, they talk about Roe being the law of the land and reaffirm some of the things, but they've been really reticent and haven't wanted to say that whole women's health is a precedent they would uphold.
Yeah, and I'd say that's also by design. There's a couple legal principles in terms of like whether you consider Roe super precedent, and that it's one of those cases that's been cited so many times that it's sort of unmovable. I hear conservatives say that, and even Kavanaugh said that in his confirmation hearing. But conservatives don't actually believe in the idea of super precedent. So that, like, when they say that, don't believe them, because they have no problem overturning it all the time. And not just even most recently, like this goes back, Citizens United is a very stark example of that. Like, we see the ability of the conservatives on the Supreme Court to craft doctrine as they see fit. So there's that part of it. And then I got on a tangent and I forgot the other.
The hazards of interviewing Jess and Imani.
I got all fired up and then lost my second point.
I mean, that sounds about right for right now. Is there anything else that you guys want to talk about in this area before we close out?
I just think that it's important to know for people who are just now sort of getting involved in abortion rights movement and these fights, it's important to be careful of the language that you use, right? I think it's important to use terms like later abortion and not late-term abortion. I think it's good to start practicing saying pregnant people and pregnant person rather than pregnant women. And also I think that it's important to not, sort of like Jess and I are lawyers and we're kind of tea leaf readers, so we are automatically going to sort of look at the parade of horribles. But just as a group of people who believe in abortion rights, I think it's a really good idea to continue to reaffirm that abortion is legal and that you can obtain abortion in all of the states. Now you have to check and see, what week's gestation those abortion providers stop providing them at. But, a lot of these laws, I think, are freaking people out to such an extent that you hear people saying stuff like, if I'm on a plane on my way to Georgia and I have a miscarriage, as soon as I land at Hartsfield Atlanta Airport, I'm going to get arrested. That's not true. And I think you're just sort of fomenting stress and unnecessary anxiety by saying things like that. And then additionally, I think it's important to support abortion funds. If you are getting involved in this fight now, there are a lot of people who have been doing it for a long time and would love the help. So call your local abortion fund, see what you can do to help, see if you want to donate money, if you want to offer, your time and services in terms of clinic escorting or something of that nature. I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm glad that there are people that are getting fired up, but I'm concerned that some people are sort of reinventing the wheel, and then that's not necessary.
No, definitely have heard about that happening. Well, this is perfect, because my last question is always, people are seeing all this stuff, what can they do to fight back? So that's a great start to that.
Donate your time and funds if you can, and also don't be afraid to talk about abortion with whoever will listen to you. And we all have relative zones of safety that we can do that. And so I recognize that that's not the same for everyone. But when we talk about the way that people's minds are changed, it is about learning, right? You're not going to, and a large part of that is just because the anti-choice movement has really dominated the conversation and has been allowed to dominate the conversation despite the fact that public opinion has not been on their side and isn't on their side. And so the only way we don't allow them to dominate the conversation is by, quite frankly, talking over them.
And I have it on, and I can tell you personally firsthand that Jess will talk to literally anyone about abortion, including bartenders at like 2 a.m.
I mean, that's the perfect time.
You know, I mean, I have some privilege in my position to be able to do that, and so that's one thing that I can do. You know, I mean, Imani, it is something that we do. I love your stories of, you know, talking to your dentist and things like that. I mean, people are actually, this is a good moment to do that because folks are interested and engaged, and want to know. And so if you have the ability to preach the gospel of abortion, then I encourage you to do so.
Great. Well, thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it. Make sure to check out Jess and Imani on Boom Lawyered. It's an amazing podcast. You will learn all the things you need to know about reproductive justice and rights from a legal perspective, and check them out on Rewire.news, and also follow them on Twitter. Jess is at Hegemami and Imani's at Angry Black Lady. For more information, including show notes from this episode and previous episodes, please visit our website at rePROsFightBack.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at rePROsFightBack. If you like our show, please help others find it by sharing it with your friends and subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks for listening.